Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second lecture in this Ad Jensen, I should say, as a non-German speaker. I have to remember the J, the Yoruba is spelled J-O-R-U-B-A in German. So the Jensen Lecture for this month, and 4:15 is an interesting time. It's when the blood sugar is dropping. So if you haven't had sugar and coffee, I'll try to keep you awake anyway. And I want to dance around a little bit with something of an experimental style, not too much, just to anticipate what's coming down the road. What I wanted to emphasize here was a kind of methodological launching pad that gives you a sense, and gives me a sense, of how to define ritual and its historical recovery mechanisms as an object of knowledge and an object of research. And that involves methodology in its simplest terms of how do you get what you want, but also in its most abstract conceptual terms of how do you construct an object domain which has to make epistemological sense. So this is going to be implicit, not explicit, in the discussion. So I'm going to mix up styles of delivery a little bit. You'll see what I mean. And that's going to run through the next couple. So to the next lecture, a week from today, I'm going to focus on my ethnographic material. And I think you'll be, if you're with me, a little bit relieved because today is still a little bit on the abstract level, although at least I illustrate what I see as the ritual archive with an example, and also I illustrate how to access through ritual performance, practice, and spirit possession, how do you bring the past into the present, and what kind of past is it? So those examples will at least hopefully convince you that I'm not totally out of my mind here. And of course the reference I'm making in the title here, an operating manual for the ritual archive, comes from a slightly quirky, slightly crazy, very brilliant design theorist who invented the geodesic dome. Do you know who I mean? Architect, mathematician, Buckminster Fuller. And he wrote a very famous book in the 60s called An Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And the idea was to understand that at the point where we were starting the first round of ecological awareness, to realize that our planet is not endless and boundless and all there is. Our planet is a little spaceship in Earth, and if we don't take care of it, we will be in trouble. And we are now still in trouble. But that's a theme for a later day. But that's the implicit reference here. So I wanted to, I'm going to read this paper, but I want to start with a proverb. I'll pick it up soon. Ogboni meji, odeta. Two ogbonis, it becomes three. I'll get there. If you are initiated into the Yoruba Ogboni society, as was Leo Frobenius, you learn how to leave the sacred lodge silently, walking backwards. You leave backwards. The reason for this is, of course, wrapped up in secrecy. Like pretty much everything about this cult of the earth, whose guardians protected against abominations such as murder and incest through silent and invisible channels of retribution and judicial execution. Walking backwards is a way of hiding your tracks. Enslaved escapees in the Americas are known to have silently slipped away from their masters by walking backwards to confuse those who would soon follow in pursuit. Perhaps departing backwards from an Ogboni lodge throws off those who wish or attempt to follow impending vectors of retributive justice. What's going on over there? Who's going to get killed next? Perhaps they walk backwards because once one enters an Ogboni lodge, once one becomes a member, one never fully departs, even when returned to the earth, especially when returned to the earth. Maybe they are departing backwards in time to keep their secret secret forever. Or maybe it is simply a matter of respect for the most senior queen-like Earth Mother, who should never behold one's backside. So you have to put your face to her as you leave. It's disrespectful, like a monarch. One thing is clear, which is that in the Ogboni society, entering and exiting were, and still are, often matters of life and death. Ogboni meji, odeta, two Ogboni, it becomes three, the saying goes, because the secret between them becomes the third member. So you have one member, another member, the secret that binds them is also a member. Among other things, this mini proverb says a lot about the semantics of Yoruba quantification, referring to the two Ogboni members with the singular pronoun, it, and including the relation between two members of a set as a member of the same set. Paradoxical indeed. So what I want to emphasize here is first of all, these are two Ogboni members. You may not know that. On first guess, it just looks like two guys at a festival shaking hands. What is unusual about this handshake? Just looking at it as an outsider. What do you think distinguishes itself from a handshake you might give, for example? They don't? Well, that may be because of my timing. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe because of the timing. Which hand? Left hand. So Ogbonis shake with the left hand, which is otherwise it's considered very dirty because among other things, without toilet paper, that's the hand you, with water, actually it's cleaner than toilet paper, but that's another issue. You're doing it with the left hand, which is the hand of pollution. If you hand money to somebody, never use your left hand. You don't eat with your left hand. Leftness, as we know from the standard anthropological literature, is associated with, challenges to the status quo. It's a marked category in relation to right. Death in the Left Hand, a famous book. It's a dangerous, problematic, slightly taboo space. And it also makes sense only in relation to the body. Left and right are egocentric, corporeocentric values. It's not something you can map out from a bird's eye view. So the other thing I want to point out about this image is what it seems to be hovering over. So we are at a festival in a subordinate village called Imojo, and this is where the Orisha of kingship dropped in order to crown the local chief as a royal. And all of these spaces that exist at the center of a kingdom that has a recognized chieftaincy with a crown reenact the founding myth at Ile-Ife, where man and kingship was created. So basically, what we're having in this, what looks like an innocuous greeting, is in fact a powerful calibration. It's a ritual calibration through bodily practice that indexes a deep form of membership that is oriented toward the ground, toward the earth, because the Ogboni society worships Onile, the goddess, she's actually feminine, of the earth. So I'll say no more about that. So according to Yoruba ritual protocols, including entering and exiting, I'm proceeding backwards and introducing the idea of the ritual archive because I should be opening the road with an offering to the trickster deity Eshu, rather than closing it off by retracing steps not yet taken. So let me quickly dash Eshu with a spot of alcohol to avoid offending him. I brought this. I prepared. This is something I can't get in the United States because of American stupid policy against Cuba. This is Havana Club. Beautiful. I even like it more than some of the the rums further east that are sweeter. This is just perfect. So I'm just going to splash a little bit to Eshu just so he doesn't piss us off and make our PowerPoint disappear or do whatever he loves to do. Trickster deity. And I would even say, Eshu la ro, bi le ye 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 ye, bi le ye. Eshu of Aro, like the bird nest, like the house of a bird, yay, 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 and then it's an onomatopoetic rendering of the bird visiting different houses in the bush. And then I say, Eshile konfunwa, shiona funwa, open the door for us, open the road for us. Ejekalo parabo da da, let us go there and come back well. So now we're cool, now we're okay. I will be moving backwards as an expository strategy by starting with the ritual archive as an admittedly complex empirical object before sketching it in conceptual and theoretical terms. In a certain perverse way, it makes sense to approach the ritual archive backwards before we know what it is, because moving forwards and backwards in space and time activates the temporalities by which the ritual archive brings the past into the present in ways that characterize the public rituals of religious festivals and commemorative ceremonies more generally, not just in Yoruba land. In today's lecture, I won't be talking about the Yoruba ritual archive as such, since that will come next week. Today, I would like to proceed by bringing the ritual archive into virtual view as an empirical object of knowledge and research, doing so to highlight its more abstract features as a critical framework for housing history in shrines, but also for accessing and channeling the past, retrieving the past, and also even accessing the future through various symbolic logics, schematic transpositions, and performative techniques. In the sections that follow, I shall first discuss a useful methodology or operating manual for generating data on ritual archives and disclosing some of the distinctive forms, temporalities, and contents that characterize the stuff that's inside of them, the history, the historical stuff. Second, I want to provide two straightforward illustrations of how history was ritually housed in the Niger Delta, because it gives such a good illustration from the evidence provided. But also how history becomes ritually accessed or channeled. And for that example, I go to an initiation ceremony in Haiti. Third, I problematize the core, in the third section of the lecture, the core dialectic of repressed and expressed historical memories activated by ritual in relation to questions of what actually happened, which I foregrounded last week. This final section will work toward a provisional model of the ritual archive that incorporates key insights from Paul Connerton's How Societies Remember and from Sigmund Freud's classic, if still controversial, Totem and Taboo. So now I'm going to steps toward an ethnography of the ritual archive. So now we're moving forward, not backwards. When I started my first tenure-track job at the University of Chicago in the autumn of 1989, Saul Tax had been retired already for 15 years, but he still attended the defenses of graduate student research proposals where he always posed the same question: what will you do when you get off the plane? There are many assumptions there that you have to do anthropology elsewhere, but he's old school. He was old in 1989. He died easily in his 90s, in the early 1990s. The question seemed an updated version of what will you do when you get off the boat. That was probably how it originated in his day. And it seemed, this question, ludicrously simplistic at the time. Here we were, sitting around to intimidate our graduate students with a lot of sort of theoretical demands. How are you going to connect the dots? How are you going to do this? And he comes along and asks this very simple question: what are you going to do? And I remember thinking, that's lame. That's not really, in fact, it was brilliant. So the question seemed simplistic at the time, but it audaciously reframed expectations away from the burdens of intellectual justification and the University of Chicago's obsession with the life of the mind towards the most mundane practicalities of conducting fieldwork. I was surprised by how many students had trouble answering his question. Methodology may seem simple in theory, but in practice, it's very challenging. I'm still surprised by how many graduate students fall woefully short in what I consider to be the core section of any research prospectus. And that's one reason why my master class on the, I think the 27th, 8th, or 8th, is going to be on basically the genre of proposal writing and the role of methodology in that. So let us put the life of the mind on hold for a moment, and invoking the spirit of Saul Tax, one of the most politically progressive American anthropologists of the 20th century, turn to a more active consideration of how to proceed in collecting relevant data on what I'm calling ritual archives, and the kinds of pasts, memories, and histories they contain and make available to relevant communities and social actors. The following methodological outline offers the core of a roadmap I've developed over the last couple of decades, which, messy as it remains, helps me navigate the otherwise overwhelming complexities of the kind of public festivals and rituals that I work on in West Africa and the Caribbean, in the so-called Afro-Atlantic, Black Atlantic, or the African, Atlantic. If my template-like outline gives the impression of reifying rituals as bounded set pieces cut off from the flux of history, politics, and everyday life, it does so heuristically, precisely to highlight those broader relationships to its variable and dynamic contexts. Methodologies are noble lies and critical fictions. Like the state of nature in Rousseau's Second Discourse, they enable valid conclusions from conjectural assumptions that may be historically or empirically false, but which reveal significant truths. So here's what I do when I get off the plane. Now, what I've done here is take 6 sort of basic categories. In your mind, just picture that each one is about 1.5 pages of subcategories and lists. And if I just read through that, you would be bored through your toes. So I'm just going to ask you to listen vaguely to some of my arbitrarily picked passages as I zoom through this, but I also want you to think about the categories, the 6 categories, don't lose sight of them. That's what I'm trying to say. So spatial frames are very important. There's a lot that gets fit within this. But really, spatial frames have to do with the locations of hidden histories. And the histories are intimately associated with space. I remember I was in one of the chiefly quarters of Ayene, and after our interview, I said, by the way, the chief of Anissa quarter said something slightly differently about the shrine at Onigogo, Eshu Onigogo. Can you tell me a little bit about why this would be the case? He said, if you want the history of Onissa quarter, you must go to Onissa quarter and get the history. And at the time I thought, well, he's just being diplomatic. He doesn't want to be responsible for saying something that might, make that the chief there or the historians, the opitans. But then I realized, no, you have to actually be sitting in the right place. And in many cases, the history related will be preceded by oblations and incantations to make sure nothing goes awry. So underneath spatial frames, first of all, the cosmological structure of deities. Think about Catholic saints if you want a very crude, well, it's not such a crude analogy because in the Iberian Americas, the Yoruba Orisha syncretized with the Catholic saints. So there actually is a very strong homology between them. But they're not just existing in a conceptual space. They exist in shrines and in altars and in cathedrals. And in cemeteries. So you have to really look at where the histories touch the ground. Look at that ground. So shrines and altars, internal organization. The shrine is not just a house without internal rooms. The gods have different altars clustered around a senior god, so you have to look at that. So that's the internal organization of the shrine, including the practitioners, their titles, status categories, ritual associations with other groups. Their external articulation, very important, record the alignments between shrines and shrine segments with private domiciles, rooms, lineages, neighborhoods, streets, quarters, villages, kingdoms, competitive political units, subunits. And that's just to get the basic spatial map. Classification of deities, heroes, ancestors, indigents, immigrants, former kings, former slaves, all sorts of things. In the New World, you get Europeans, also in West Africa, Creoles, and also the specification of coastal hinterland axes. If you're on a coast, certain gods represent hinterland topographies. If you're in the inland, certain gods represent coastal topographies. So these are all the spatial aspects. Deictic axes of the corporeal field are very important. So in a spatial sense, and this bleeds into the performative frame as well, but we pay attention to exiting and entering, as I opened the paper with, lifting and dropping, putting down, turning right and turning left, circling. These are all movements that take place in time, but they make no sense without a spatial orientational axis. So the spatial aspect of deictic performatives has to be mapped out, and then the movement itself, going and coming. You know, during the opening of during the conclusion of a festival, an Orisha festival, when the priestesses come down after 7 days of hard work, of daily processing and sacrificing, and then they come out of their possession and become themselves again, the first thing you say to them is, "Ekabo, welcome. Welcome back. Now you're back," because they've been somewhere else. They haven't been themselves. So all of these, and they've been historic personages in many cases. So these are things that you can jump to more quickly if you have the right sort of set of criteria to fill in at the beginning. So that's just spatial frames. Temporal performative frames, ritual calendars, performative cycles in relation to agricultural cycles, market cycles, social activities, lunar cycles, and even menstrual cycles are linked. They don't exist in one calendrical groove. Changes in deities in the ritual calendar over the years, when a former chieftain, subordinate chieftaincy rises up to become a royal kingship, its Orisha will start the year rather than just follow it like the third event in the year. So things become revised, and you can't figure that out if you don't have a diachronic perspective. In terms of the performative genres, ritual speech is very important: songs, praises, invocations, drum languages, dialect vary. Drum language is very important because most of the drumming is to the dancers. It's giving choreographic cues. Talk about linking the body with speech. On the other hand, when important outsiders walk into the arena, then of course the drums will point to, index the newcomer, and then start drumming praises. And when you're an Oyibo, a so-called European, the expectation is you will reward them with a lot of money. So when the drummers started coming up to me, they got to know me pretty well. I was like, no. And I learned how to preempt the whole logic of extraction by quickly going up and giving them something small, and then backing up. So I obeyed the grammar, but I was becoming Yoruba. I was figuring out how to do it without getting, because they will never stop. They will just drum and drum and drum and drum until your pockets are until you've emptied your entire bank account. And then they'll keep drumming and say, "Oyibo, the problem with you is boom, 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 boom. You never spend money." And it's like, never spend money? What? And it's like, that's not the point. That's the game. So anyway, here we go. Techniques of the body, performative arenas, processions, and then with symbolic logic, syntax and semantics, there is a kind of, there's almost a sort of logical calculus at work in ritual action that takes a while to see. Some of the key principles of what I call the symbolic logic of ritual has to do with key symbols. You have condensation. Some symbols have multiple reference ambiguities. Often these meanings can be oppositional. A dialectical image is that which sustains a contradiction, which makes sense in social orders because we all have in our societies contradictions. They can't be figured out by law, so you have to mediate them through ritual. Displacement is another one. Think of René Girard's Violence in the Sacred and the role of the scapegoat in embodying the accumulated dirt of the year. You sacrifice it, you purify the community. Paradigmatic and syntagmatic substitutions and selections, a little bit of Jakobsonian poetics here. These correspond to sympathetic versus contagious magic, in a sense. Sympathetic is the logic of resemblance. If you want to fix somebody's skin of a bad skin disease, you grab a chicken that has pox and sacrifice, or at least that's the idea. And contagious is when if you want to cool down, you rub, or want someone to cool down, you rub palm oil on their head, because the palm oil has the ritual valence, among other things, of turning hot into cool. Ritual grammars also, such as prescriptive sequences, you have to do it this way, taboo violations, associated idioms of purity and pollution, authority and power. You have deep generative structures and even regenerative. The emphasis on fertility is really about regeneration, not generation. It's about regeneration. And when we look at museums at so many dolls that have been listed as fertility dolls from West Africa, that's just a tiny piece of the story, because they're being used to rebirth social orders during ritual. And that homology is very important. You also have idioms of negation. If you think about predicate logic with not, and, if, then, and things like that, you have not manifest in hot ritual items that burn the object or the procession or the value or power. Negation sunders, it differentiates, it splits. And then you have conjunction, corresponding with cool ritual powers of suturing, of integration. Hotness, negation, can be applied to the dismemberment of the corporate body. And coolness, often symbolized by salt and kola nut and breast milk as a symbol, corresponds to rememberment, which is actually part of the way the memory of the community gets recollected after it gets separated. That's where it's a space of memory recovery right there. And the analogy doesn't just work in English. And then you have invocations, performative utterances, like under logics of practice. We know from semiotics that symbolic meaning breaks into a kind of propositional content, metaphorical content, but also pragmatic functions, like summoning, cursing, praising, praying, indexing time, now and then, and space, here, there, distal versus close. Participation frameworks. What do the priestesses mean when they say we? We are coming to give our blessing to Ile Ilaro, Omoaro. Wait a minute. We means only the descendants of Omoaro. So that song differentiates the practitioners from a whole group of immigrant groups that came who are not Omoaro. But you don't know that if you're just watching the spectacle. But these are the kinds of restructuring of context that take place during a ritual performance. So then we have historical frames, operational techniques. I'll never finish if I don't move on, so I'm going to have to move on. But I want to just show a few more slides to illustrate what I mean by negation. So the Ogun priest here is with his wife, actual wife, whose title in the cult is called Yeyemole, which is really mother or grandmother of the Imole, of the priestesses. But her outfit and her role, she often wears a crown-like cap, she's the female equivalent of a male chief in a kingdom, but she's in effect, cross-male equivalent of the leader of the civic dimension of the cult within the town. There's a bush leader as well, who's an Ologun, a warrior. So she's a collective person who brings powers together, but still has the power to sunder. And he is the divider. He's a warrior. He manifests Ogun. In his right hand is a cutlass stick, but it's the left hands I want you to look at. The left hand of Ogboni greetings, which in this case holds palm fronds, just like Palm Sunday, except different. These palm fronds are very distinctive features. They're very distinctive signs of danger of rupture. And the reasoning I told is it's kind of interesting. It's the palm frond. It's called the cloth of Ogun, and Ogun's the god of war. And why is that? Because the flat part of it is soft, but the edge is sharp and cuts. And in the left hand, ultimately it's the weapon of deposition, of taking the head off of a king. So it's a strong symbol. She can do it too, but her role is to take that negativity, the negation of negativity, and to suture it. And the red and white, the predominant whiteness of her robe and cut with red shows the predominance of the suturing within the potential to divide, whereas the predominant redness of the Ogun is really about dismembering, not remembering. And given the sort of what is actually technically the fuzzy logic of Yoruba ritual powers and their classification, you never have a deity or an icon or a set of beads that is either all white or all red. There's always a little white in the red one, and there's always a little red in the white one, because the idea of these powers is not that they occupy distinct places, but that they are immanent in everything. And through your ritual procedures, your knowledge, and your practice, one of those values gets highlighted and the other one gets repressed. All women in Yoruba have the capacity to be witches. So there are ceremonies that use witchcraft of priestesses, because all of the priestesses are witches. They use witchcraft to allay witchcraft, to fight witchcraft, to put it down. But they can always bring it out if somebody messes with them. So that's the dynamic we're dealing with. So let me see. Let me keep going a little bit. So here we have what I call double negation. Palm fronds in both hands. And this makes sense because the deity of Oloke comes from an immigrant subgroup in Ayede that brought their own kingship and had to relinquish it. So she comes out, she's actually embodying a historic office that cannot be acknowledged publicly because it's treason. You can't have two kings in a Yoruba kingdom. There's a proverb about that. So she's got two hands which on one level cancel each other out because ultimately she's performing for the positivity of the community, but with her left hand or her right hand, she's posing potential threats to the normative kingship of as a whole. And she's wearing, laba, these panels that represent royalty. So that's a kind of ritual crown on her head that carries a revitalizing water that ultimately at the end of the festival is regenerative. So she's evoking the sovereignty of Ikole, a kingdom that nearby where this segment of immigrants came from. It's the devotees' historic town of origin. So she's possessed by Ikole kingship, and she's threatening to, it's a message to the king, if you don't recognize us properly, we have the potential to overthrow you. Now here's a conjunction, suturing, bonding, remembering. This is one of the purest expressions I think I have on film from of a revitalizing fluid, of something that is about as opposite of hot as you can get. It's called omiero, softening water, smoothing water, soothing water. And it's taken inside an Ogboni lodge, Iledi it's called. And the snail fluid is used medicinally also to clot blood. So you can see how, and it does. If you're a hemophiliac and you cut yourself, this will save your life. So there is a complex ritual economy going on. And what's interesting also is that the shot glass, which you just sort of think is a convenient way of passing around the fluid, which does get sipped in this group. The shot glass is a holdover from the early rituals of breaking trade when they arrived on the coast of the Nigerian, what is now the Nigerian coastland, and became central objects of rituals of breaking trade. So they kind of manifest in their iconicity the history of Afro-European trade relations going back really, I mean, these kinds of trade things started in the 17th century, but contact was earlier. And then here, on the outside, in a public festival in the neighboring town of Ishan, you see the exchange of kola. And, there's this, again, this is a suturing. And what I wanted to point out about red and white is that the redness of either red cloth or red kola nut does represent blood, but it represents blood in two capacities. On the one hand, blood that is spilled and causes death, but also blood that mixes with, it's female blood that mixes with male semen to create new life. And here we have the mixture. We have a kind of passage of ritual paraphernalia, and salt neutralizes curses. That's the other thing. So we have a binding agent that gets circulating around, which then gets embodied by the sartorial codes, the clothing of the priestesses themselves, who become themselves agents both of redness, of potential division, and instead of palm fronds in the left hand, what do you see in the right hand? And they're all holding them. What's that first priestess holding? Whoops, I mean, you might not be able to see exactly what it is, but I mean, just describe it. What color is it? Okay, and anyway, it's a kind of, it's a staff of office. It's actually a horsetail. It comes from horsetail, and it's about civic authority. So it's rightness is going through, and it's at the end of the day, it's recollecting. It's classifying the kingdom after the different parts of it have been processed and isolated around. So the priestesses themselves become like blood and money throughout the town. So anyway, that's just a few ways in which one can open up the methodology section here. So now, forgive me as I figure out where I am. So these methodological guidelines, and the last one, operational techniques, simply has to do with whether, do you use a digital audio recorder? Do you use audio visual? What kind of notebooks do you use? What kind of diagrams do you make? Whether it's kinship, whether it's network, whether it's links between shrines. What kind of archives are you going to consult to provide longitudinal depth to your data? What is available, if anything? But I also want to draw attention to what my colleague Stéphane Pommier has called the ethnographic interface, because it's the operational techniques that form it's not just the mediating interface between ethnographer and the sociocultural field in which she or he works, but it also is itself a semi-permeable membrane. And it's where, it's what Latour called where the inscription devices of objectifying, recording objects of knowledge that fall under the category of culture and society are actually created. So it's also a very productive area. It's not just a tool. So according to Yoruba protocols, including entering and exiting, here we go. All right, so these guidelines are clearly tailored to the kinds of ritual that I engage in my research. And although I've tried to purge them of this influence by proposing a general approach to ritual archives, they would have to be adapted to different cultural and historical contexts, and I expect that, and they can be. So let us turn to the general organizational principles of my ritual roadmap over and above the kinds of contents they contain. So invoking my preoccupation in the last lecture with Kant and Cassirer, in the spirit but not the letter of Kant's critical framework, I've started in sections 1 and 2, spatial frames, temporal frames, with something like his transcendental aesthetic, the space-time manifold of pure intuition in which representations of objects can take place and endure as the first requirement of organizing experience. This is the critique of pure reason's kind of outline. Kant's transcendental commitment to forms of absolute space and time assumed a Newtonian universe, and when shaken by Einstein's theory of relativity in the early 20th century, was nonetheless deftly defended by Cassirer's distinction between the empirical space and time of the physicist and the philosopher's pure or transcendental spatial and temporal forms. The distinction is useful because it allows us to deploy space and time separately as heuristic categories for collecting relevant data without imposing essentialized spatio-temporal ideas on cultures where they are empirically experienced and understood very differently. Think, for example, of Bourdieu's conceptualization of practical time, which in most so-called peasant societies speeds up during the harvest season and slows down during winter, when farmers retire from their fields to repair tools and tend to their livestock. Or his critique of the synoptic illusion, in which the annual cycle of a community's rituals, represented in homogeneous linear time, breaks down into multiple cycles of elastic duration. In some cases, with each subcommunity opening the cycle when the time for its own ritual arrives. And I experienced this firsthand when I went to the palace and said, well, which festivals do you celebrate over the course of a year, and what is the sequence? And from there I would say, well, it starts with Yemoja, and then it proceeds to Orisha Yagba, and then it goes all the way back to Orisha Arjuna in July, and then it's done. And then when you go to Orisha Yagba, they're the ones who start. And then everything comes around it. And then you go to the Orisha Arjuna, they're the beginning. And you say, well, at the palace they said, no, that one's wrong. We are the ones who came here first. We are the original. And that's why our festival is now. So the idea that you can lump this into one authoritative calendar is what Bourdieu brilliantly calls the synoptic illusion. Because people on the ground in their practical mode of interaction it doesn't exist that way. It's a distortion when you abstract. It's part of the violence of abstraction, actually. So, rituals, another way of looking at it is they do not take place in time and space. Where does this take place and when does it take place? But rather they produce time and space through their generative principles and practices. So none of that gets sacrificed when you take space and time as abstract analytics. It makes it easier to emphasize what the actual practical logic is by contrast. Keeping with our Kantian analogy, sections 3 and 4, symbolic logics and logic of practice, of the ritual methodology might roughly correspond to Kant's table of categories, in which he lays the groundwork for those a priori synthetic propositions that somehow allow us to make the world knowable to us, a world that provides content not only to lived experience, mathematics, and scientific knowledge, but also for our particular purposes, the past, under various synthetic modes of historical consciousness, including the mode of determining what actually happened. Cassirer's treatment of language, myth, religion, and history as culturally constituted symbolic forms that emerge historically as prior regulative frameworks opens up a much broader range of symbolic mechanisms for ordering experience and our understanding of the past, at least broader than what you would find in the Critique of Pure Reason. Thus, section 3 on symbolic logics provides something of a logical syntax for capturing the semantics of ritual symbols, while section 4 on logics of practice identifies those categories of ritual action that bring ritual power, including a good deal of the past, into the present for collective renewal and regeneration. You could argue that, well, practical logic, that belongs to the second critique, the critique of practical reason, but enough of that already. And that Cassirer might place what I'm calling historical frames more within what he considered to be the domains of myth and religion in no way discourages their utility for historical interpretation when they're treated as primary sources in this respect, because by doing that they are reframed by a new symbolic form, the historical one, in which they acquire historical significance. Anyway, so much for methodological schemas, the analytic relations for linking categories of data, and the operational procedures for collecting the relevant material. What do ritual archives look like? And here, by way of two basic illustrations, we shift to two descriptions from the first half of the 20th century. One from a traveling commissioner in southern Nigeria, whose 1904 campaign against human sacrifice and cannibalism sent him up the mangrove creeks of the Niger Delta, where he confronted what he believed was Africa's heart of darkness. The other from a Black American dancer anthropologist's 1937 initiation into the Vodou cult of Dambala in Haiti. If the former illustration emphasizes the shrine as a semi-bounded archive of historical documents, the second highlights the performative dynamics of accessing the past as a mode of empowerment, a mode of ritual empowerment. So now I want to shift to the second section, Atlantic Sketches of Ritual Archives. And I just want to do a quick time check because, all right, I'm woefully behind, so I'm going to be doing some skipping here. For Captain Alfred A. Whitehouse, pulling down the idols represented the endgame of a British policy that began in the mid-19th century with missionaries saving souls and accelerated with the firepower of the Royal Niger's Company in its hostile takeover of the hinterland trade. By 1904, the Royal Niger Company's royal charter had been revoked, and the protectorate of southern Nigeria was taking shape. Unlike the missionaries and merchants who preceded him, Whitehouse was an officer of the British Crown, and he perceived the iniquities of local fetish houses, as he called them, in political terms, as instruments of chiefly oppression and as obstacles to the rationality of an emerging colonial economy and administration. After burning down a central fetish house in Alabia, the seat of the Andoni chieftaincy of the Niger Delta, close to the Igbo area, Whitehouse learned of another such juju deep in the bush, and he returned days later to finish the job. And now I quote a passage that he published in 1905. Embarking in small canoes, we paddled for some distance up a narrow and tortuous channel in the mangrove swamp, landing finally in a gloomy grove, a narrow pathway leading to the place where we were in quest of. In this hut were found many skulls and bones of victims, and all the paraphernalia used in the juju ceremonies, consisting of ivory tusks, an ivory horn with 5 human skulls attached, the swearing pot, emitting a frightful stench when broken, copper spears and swords, a bronze man from the lower Niger, iron sculpture, a stool decorated with the heads of dogs, goats, and pigs, skulls is what he means, sacrificial pots, copper coils, large manillas, and other old forms of native currency, and many other objects of interest. One of the most interesting finds, he says, was a ship's bell, which evidently at one time belonged to an old Dutch slaver, being inscribed Otto Baker Rotterdam, 1757. And I looked up the house, and indeed it was a bronze casting house in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam rather, at that time. What follows is an example, is an ethnographic account. This is interesting. The same man who wants to destroy this pagan shrine also takes meticulous documentation of its contents. And this shows you the two sides of anthropology, doesn't it? So he starts documenting the meanings, the beliefs, the cannibalistic customs, and he wasn't all wrong on that, associated with these objects, replete with linguistic glosses, photographic documentation, and the acknowledged assistance of a native informant. And in keeping with the spirit of scientific inquiry, the contents of the destroyed bush shrine, including, quote, a length of drain pipe of European manufacture. This is not the sort of thing you expect to find in an inland shrine, that is sort of the opposite of European quote, civilization. So all of this stuff was sent to the British Museum, where they remain to this day as the Andoni hoard in the ethnography department. And so let me show you this rather, and this is an image that he himself published in this 1905 article. So fetish objects in the Andoni Juju house. And it's really interesting because the one thing I'm not clear about is whether this iconic representation of colonial authority is also in the shrine as a way of acquiring it, of that power, the way that you find carvings of colonial officers inside shrines, or whether it was White House's sort of statement of subjugation. Here's the conquest, kind of a Theodore Roosevelt move, take on. But here you see, yes, there are human skulls. There are all manner of manillas and copper items. And very interestingly, here is the bell. And just imagine how, and I think these might be drain pipe, I don't know. But so this bell is a key, really, to understanding the accumulative archiving kind of logic of shrines. Some people will think, well, it's misplaced there because it's not an indigenous object. It's obviously something that was already presupposes European contact. But that's the whole point. The whole point is that what more powerful icon of the slave trade at that period, 1750s, was, if you go to the slave trade database by Eltis, that is the period of the highest volume of captives going out to the Americas in the entire slave trade. This is a period where huge amounts of wealth are accruing to the merchant princes and chiefs and canoe house chiefs in the Niger Delta who are profiting from this. So what better way to acquire that wealth and power than to acquire one of the most fundamental signifiers of the ship that brings its wealth and it takes away its captives. So let me just proceed because we're running late. Much can be made of the narrative registers of White House's discourse, one sensational and moralistic, depicting the dense scrub, ghastly skulls, frightful stench, and terrible rites of a hidden hinterland. The other, sensible and scientific, with religious beliefs and marriage ceremonies fleshing out an emerging field of knowledge. Here I emphasize the fetishized forms of history that White House's expedition unwittingly exposed. First, there are the objects themselves, skulls, both human and animal, bone and bronze, as well as a bronze sculpture of an Ijo man, representing what we would now call the Lower Niger bronze industry, a swearing pot, spears, swords, canoe paddles, tusks, bones, carved sticks, a drum made from human skin, and this is very common in neighboring groups like the Ogoni, where you'll find sculptures with human skin on them. Portuguese manillas. This is the first layer of European slave trade. And to White House's surprise, the ship's bell from a Dutch slaver, dated 1757. Clearly, some of these objects and sacra are very old. They date from at least the mid-18th century, combining sacrificial items and ritual paraphernalia with potent icons of the slave trade. Second, as objects of concentrated power and value, the fetishes embody historical relations in their very materiality. In the Portuguese manillas, as commodity forms, indeed money forms, they evoke the first European wave of Atlantic slavery beginning in the late 15th century and kicking into high gear by the 1750s. As for the bronze, let me just draw attention to the manillas, which were used as money forms up until the 1940s in this area. As for the bronze skulls of leopards and the human skulls of sacrificial victims not directly implicated in economic exchange, they congealed ritual relations of political authority over vassal villages, prisoners of war, exposed witches, and domestic slaves who were slain, quote, slain in the annual sacrifice to the gods. And then I'm going to reproduce a somewhat a kind of exoticist image that came out of the Illustrated London News, actually a little bit before this, but this was the kind of image circulating in the public sphere in Britain, which kind of exaggerates in effect the very kinds of images that you find in this particular shrine, even though the shrine destruction occurred after this image was published. So I'm jumping ahead here. And finally, we note the logic of attraction and incorporation so characteristic of enshrined ritual sacra. Like the ship's bell, the Portuguese manillas, and even the European drain pipe, potent ritual icons in Africa often fetishize the foreign, bringing the outside in through ritual exchange or a mimetic appropriation. You can acquire the object, or you can paint an image of it, or carve an object that resembles it. And by doing that, they tap into the external resources of power and value to revitalize kingdoms and local communities. And I call that a kind of synthetic proposition, because it's taking two things that are separate and they're bringing the object of representation into its own possession, even when it's an image of it. Such shrines are sacred sites of a ritualized mode of space-time compression. As privileged repositories of sacred objects, they convert external commodities and associated value forms into ritual resources, thus archiving congealed temporalities, whole historical periods like the period of the slave trade, within their protective walls. And it also can be skulls that represent historical relations between warring kingdoms. It's not just about slavery. Whether in West Africa or within the British Museum. So it's interesting that the same ritual archive that White House discovers in Andoni land is reconstituted and documented and re-archived in the British ethnography department of the British Museum. It's really kind of not a coincidence. So what kinds of histories can we reconstruct, and with what interpretive methods effectively deployed? In preparing the groundwork for addressing these questions, we can follow Catherine Dunham. So now I'm switching from looking at a shrine as an archive to looking at an actual initiation ceremony as a way of accessing the histories housed in the shrines. So you have a library, and then you have a library card in order to retrieve the book. Well, here you have ritual methods for retrieving, taking possession, or getting possessed by those histories. For Catherine Dunham, anthropologist, choreographer, and dancer extraordinaire, marriage to Dambala, Vodou deity of the Dahomey and Rana line, was part personal quest and part professional vocation, bringing together the many worlds that she navigated throughout her remarkable career. And in the 1930s, she was actually an undergraduate, a Black American woman, light-skinned, representing the color stratification of the Black middle class in the hyper-segregated city of Chicago at that time. Probably one of the first Black women to, as an undergraduate, to be admitted to the University of Chicago. And we have her getting trained in anthropology. And then she went on to work with Boas, Franz Boas, at Columbia. So in the first stage of her initiation into Haitian voodoo, the lave-tête, or washing of the head, the body is ritually prepared to receive the loi, the deity, particularly the head, through which the devotee is mounted or possessed. Dunham's initiation structures the narrative of her ethnographic memoir, Island Possessed. It's a wonderful book if you can get a hold of it. Weaving back between Haiti and Chicago, past and present, religion and science, peasants and elites. It is her critical passage from a bossal, an untamed outsider, and a honsi, or mambo, a servitor of the gods, however, that evokes a much greater historical transformation that gave birth to the Black Atlantic world. Now I quote from her, as she describes her initiation in her memoir. "We were lying on a dirt floor, spoon fashion, well fitted to each other, 9 of us, ranging in age from 7 to 70. Both sexes, all of us candidates for initiation into the cult of Radha Dahomey. This was the second of 3 days' isolation on the floor of Teolin's Hungfor, the temple of the Vodun gods, set apart as the period of head cleansing, or lave tête. The white curtain dividing us, and lave tête also means raise the head, and that's an important ambiguity in this ritual. The white curtain dividing us was thrown out aside by priestess Teolin. Assan, which is the bell that summons the god, in hand, she stood majestically in the doorway. Hunsi, lave tête, she said, rise up and turn. We sat and turned to the other side, as we had done so every few hours since our confinement. As we settled on the other side, Teolin moved toward us. Then she was at the head of the woman in my lap. Alliance, that's the name of the woman, she said, open up and let Papa Gede come in. Gedes are spirits of the dead. They're very kind of disorderly. Then I too jerked convincingly and must have turned red in the darkness, not because of a visitation, meaning a spirit possession, but in simple surprise, then in a quick succession of anger, frustration, and annoyance. In releasing her met tête, or in the purging of bosal, met tête would be mal tête, it's like the bad head, of unclean qualities. Alliance lost control of her bladder, and the hot stream of urine spread over my new baptismal nightrobe from crotch to knee. Teolin was watching, and no extra movements were allowed. She couldn't get away. Her hard knuckles pressed my shoulders back into position against the damp floor. I held my breath and concentrated on following the entrance of Gede into Alliance. So what we glimpse in this extraordinary passage is nothing less than the Middle Passage, a ritualized palimpsest of the transshipment of slaves, packed spoon fashion, as it was called, in the fetid holds of slavers carrying their cargoes to the Americas. Confined and compacted on the floor of the Hungfor, the temple, the neophytes must rise up and turn on command of the priestess, just as the enslaved, similarly arranged in the holds of ships, were ordered to turn at given intervals by their maritime overseers. And I wonder just, Catherine Dunham combined her anthropology with her career as a world-famous dancer. She founded the Dunham Technique, and she was in charge of the Dunham Dance Troupe, which you can see in films like Stormy Weathers, starring Lena Horne in the 1940s. And I went through her archives, her own archives at the University of Southern Illinois, and I was just astonished by the circles she moved in. She was in touch with all of the major actors and artists and musicians and composers in Hollywood and New York. So here's an image of the spoon fashion. This is a famous diagram that was used by abolitionists in the 19th century in order to emphasize the inhumanity of what is basically the transformation of human life into commodities, into chattel. And the packing is sort of diagnostic of the logic of profit making, that you maximize the space, you maximize your yield. And it's the cold calculus is what is the most horrifying, one of the most horrifying aspects. And they're packed spoon fashion. I want to anticipate a little bit. So here's an artist's rendition of what it was like. This is the reenactment in ritual, in the initiation ritual, is a kind of recreation of the Middle Passage itself. And a lot of these shrines, including to the Dahomean line, have the flags of ships on them. But do they correlate this with the slave trade? No. As in a polluted hole beneath the deck, Dunham is soaked by the urine of a fellow initiate who is entered by her god. Ritually immobilized, enduring, quote, the odors of evacuation already heavily mingling with sweat and bad breath, initiations are no joke. The Middle Passage connection is not entirely lost on Dunham herself. There we lay, scarcely breathing, waiting, listening, senses alert, packed like sardines, much as the slave who crossed the Atlantic, motionless as though chained, some of us afraid. But the illusion immediately vanishes, a fleeting moment of quasi-recognition scarcely registered in the text. Whether or not such fleeting recognition was shared by her fellow neophytes remains an open question, but I suspect not. There are other significant histories memorialized in Haitian Vodou, ranging from explicit incarnations of Haitian revolutionaries, like Macandal, or even the Toussaint Louverture himself. But you also get post-19 teens in the early 20s, when the US sent in the Marines to occupy Haiti. You get US Marines that are now occupying places in the pantheon of Haitian deities. And also we get references to the development of class relations marked by ritualized repertoires of social distinction, fine foods, powder, and perfumes for Ezeli, rags, rum, and tobacco for the Gedes, spirits of the dead. So some of the lois manifest sort of the historical cultures of the elites, including the pre-revolutionary elites of the French planters, and others, the enslaved and the peasantry. Dunham's initiation also can be taken further in establishing specific homologies between social and ritual categories of bosal. So the term bosal in secular speech was a term used to describe enslaved captives who just came off the boats before they got baptized by the church in order to become sold and domesticated. In other words, they came directly from Africa. And this is a contrast between the bosal and the Creole. The Creole enslaved were born in the Americas and were thus more assimilated to European ways, more domesticated, and as a result often worked as domestic servants, slaves. In ritual terms, however, the latter meaning of bosal, the ritual term, refers to the non-initiate, one not ready for spirit possession and whose head must be baptized, lave tête, to receive the gods. So what you see here is that ritual baptism, lave tête, thus recapitulates the formal incorporation of enslaved Africans into New World societies as they acquired new names and identities within a developing field of status distinctions. But whatever specific histories we might further explore, including, as in our two examples, those shared on both sides of the Atlantic, at this point I wish simply to highlight the general features of a fetishized past, one that is congealed in objects, housed in shrines, and that we saw in the Andoni shrine, but also activated, brought back to life, brought into the present by the esoteric arts of sacrifice and spirit possession. Whereas Whitehouse's fetish house revealed a restricted archive of hidden histories, Dunham's initiation illustrates how such histories are accessed and repossessed through ritualized forms of embodiment. And as a choreographer, I found this, I was looking for images to throw this together into a PowerPoint. I had brought some images with me, others over the weekend was searching. And I started looking at snaps, pictures of her dance troupe and of her dancing. And I may be crazy, but this is what came to my mind. So, on the left, it's very poorly reproduced because of the initial quality of the image, which is intentionally that way, so it can't get ripped off by people like me. So here you have a moment in a dance, and Catherine Dunham's at the center, but again, look at how closely packed. I'm beginning to see a dialectic of implosion and explosion in her choreography, which in some way refers to that formative experience of initiation, and prior to that, the enslavement of the Middle Passage. And in this scene, which again is kind of astonishing, here she is in a kind of spoon fashion, and then, okay, this might look like the Lindsay Hop, which is a popular dance of the period, but again, we have a dance that keeps manifesting spoon packing. And this would be so diagnostic of her dance is, to me, I wonder whether there's not some level of over-determination that is creating this return of a ritualized mode of historicizing grounded in what actually happened. So let me just take a look at the time here, 4:15. So I have a lot more to go, and I'm toying with the idea of just stopping here. I'll just describe what it is I'm going to do. So in the next section, I get back into the real, what kind of a model we can start with in order to explain and take into account the relationship between a traumatic or violent event in the past, which I liken to the Freudian trauma, as Paul Ricoeur says, discussing Freud, you have a real traumatic event has to have had taken place for it to develop into a neurotic symptom for Freud. So in other words, the facticity of the original event has to be there for a Freudian logic to work. What is the Freudian logic that I'm interested in? I'm interested in the Freudian logic of how a traumatic event returns and repeats, that it's because it can't be recognized, because the subconscious represses it, it returns, it repeats. It's the basis of the return of the repressed. And there's something about, and I'm very obviously hesitant to establish a homology between individual psychosis and ritual repetition, but I think that you can de-psychologize certain aspects of Freud's model. You could even argue that the fact that individuals experience trauma this way is a bourgeois historical emergence coming from a prior form of collective experience that is dealt with through ritual purification. I know that sounds a little evolutionary and functionalist, but it's too tight. And when I read it, I deracinate Freud. I take out the facticity of the original parasite that gives birth to the totemic feast, but at the same time, I apply it to Connerton's model of looking at commemorative ceremonies in particular, and the retracing of steps, and the conversion of historical pasts into symbolic substances, that we can then take these substances of mana, or of ashe, or of grace, or of God's blood and flesh, of Jesus' blood and flesh, and we can unravel them. We can unravel these fetishized substances into the historical conditions that are erased. They're sublimated by it. So in a way, some methods from psychoanalysis along the lines of the symbolic exegesis of dreams laid out in Freud, condensation, displacement, can be productively used not only to get at to unpack the repressed memories of the ritual archive, but also explain why it has to be ritualized. So that's where I'm going with this. Hopefully not too long, I'll be putting these together in a book. I do want to read it, but I also think that if we're going to have time for discussion, there's already a lot to chew on here, so I'm going to call it quits for now. And if anybody's interested, and don't feel like you should be, because we're all busy, but if you need to know how Freud and Connerton fit in, as I needed to know, email me and I'll send you the draft. Thank you.